not water-resistant coating. They are knit water.
How did Nazi Germany blitz through Europe with such terrifying speed and relentless energy? Was it superior tactics, ruthless determination, or was there something else? Something coursing through the veins of its soldiers, giving them an almost inhuman edge. In World War II, an invisible force powered the German war machine, an unstoppable drive fueled not just by ideology, but by a tiny white pill. A pill that could keep a soldier awake for days, numb his fear, and make him feel invincible. This is the chilling story of how methamphetamines, marketed as harmless pet. How did Nazi Germany blitz through Europe with such terrifying speed and relentless energy? Was it superior tactics, ruthless determination, or was there something else? Something coursing through the veins of its soldiers, giving them an almost inhuman edge. In World War II, an invisible force powered the German war machine, an unstoppable drive fueled not just by ideology, but by a tiny white pill. A pill that could keep a soldier awake for days, numb his fear, and make him feel invincible. This is the chilling story of how methamphetamines, marketed as harmless pet pills, became the secret weapon behind the Blitzkrieg. And how, in a dark twist of irony, the very drugs that propelled Nazi conquest also pushed its soldiers to the brink of madness. When were amphetamines first used by the military? Why was it provided? Did the drug have any pronounced effect on the war? What were the benefits and detriments? Did every country use them? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Pain-relieving drugs, first marketed in Germany in 1917 as an over-the-counter pain reliever, became popular, and one was an opioid under the brand name of Eukodal, which is today labeled as oxycodone, and often sold under the brand name Roxicodone and OxyContin. It is a semi-synthetic opioid used medically for the treatment of moderate to severe pain, and is highly addictive. But another drug was becoming even more popular, and it was marketed as Pervitin, which is consumed throughout the war, although only available by prescription. But Hitler himself became addicted to Eukodal and many other drugs as the years went by, which damaged his health. The German military began experimenting with Pervitin, which is a methamphetamine that produces higher energy while reducing the need for sleep and hunger, which the military saw as a great advantage in combat. They were also impressed with the psychological impact displayed by the soldiers, as it indeed was said to spark a great enthusiasm, as well as a feeling of confidence and omnipotence. Interestingly enough, crystalline methamphetamine, or crystal meth, was first produced in Japan, and having access to that formula allowed Pervitin to be developed by Fritz Hauschild, which was patented in Germany in 1937 by the Temmler Group. It was considered as an energy booster, like caffeine but more effective, and the drug was perfectly legal over the counter until 1941. Pervitin was advertised throughout Germany and Austria, with ads placed in magazines and on billboards, until it became a controlled substance later. Temmler believed that it was an opportunity to compete with Coca-Cola, which advertised that drink's energy benefits. The Temmler Company hired the advertising firm Mathis & Son, an advertising agency headquartered in New York, to promote the drug, which was extremely successful. The population welcomed it as a cheap, harmless, and effective energy booster. Workers could work longer hours and were more productive. It was cheap, relieved depression, and it was not even considered a drug and appeared to have only beneficial effects. Many people mixed it with food and drinks. Dr. Otto Ranke, director of the Institute for General and Defense Physiology at Berlin's Academy of Military Medicine, began doing experiments with Pervitin using 90 college student volunteers, especially athletes and those in military training. He came to the conclusion that Pervitin could keep soldiers awake for days at a time, not need food as often, and march many more miles without needing rest. He called it a performance-enhancing compound. Hitler took a great interest and had it issued for the September 1939 invasion of Poland. The drug was provided in their daily rations and taken once or twice per day, and soldiers believed that it gave them supernatural capabilities. This was because soldiers could march for 3 days or more and sometimes cover up to 20 miles or more per day, carrying a full combat load of more than 50 pounds for the infantry. With pilots taking it, they were also able to fly from sunup to sundown, and Poland fell in 28 days. In his planning of the invasion of Western Europe, Hitler issued a stimulant decree in April 1940 and sent more than 35 million tablets of Pervitin and Isofan, which was a highly modified version produced by the Knoll Pharmaceutical Company, and saw 35 million dosages of Pervitin to be distributed to the military, with the infantry and armored soldiers given priority as they would be the spearhead. The Luftwaffe was also on the list, as he wanted pilots and crews able to fly longer and more frequent ground support missions. Their primary recipients among pilots were the Stuka dive bomber pilots, as stated by Kurt Kuhlmeier. Yes, we were issued the Pervitin, but it was not mandatory that we take it. But it was suggested. I took the drug, which worked faster and longer than drinking strong coffee. We had this throughout the war. We could fly more missions without being very tired. This became very important later in the war, especially in North Africa and in Russia. But we often needed a few days to recover from that. I just stopped taking it in Libya. The British Expeditionary Force, Belgian and French troops who were depending upon the Maginot Line to prevent an invasion were stunned at the speed and continuous attacks night and day, which saw German forces take more terrain in a few weeks than they had taken during the entire duration of the First World War. This was because German troops were able to function for up to 72 hours without sleep or food, advancing at a pace that allowed them to outflank and overwhelm the Allied force. The Germans managed to trap the entire British Army on the beaches of Dunkirk in what was considered one of the greatest feats in military history. The concept of blitzkrieg or lightning war, especially the uses of close air support, rolling artillery barrages, tanks attacking ground targets with infantry support, and fighters dominating the airspace over the battlefield, saw France fall in 6 weeks. The reports came in from field commanders, and the results were very impressive. Even men wounded on Pervitin seemed not to be very affected, and they continued on fighting due to the cocaine and methamphetamine combination. Because many German aircraft were shot down, some crash landing intact, and inspections were done, the British uncovered the Pervitin tablets, which were sent for analysis. The British then realized what the Germans had been using, and they began developing their own version called Benzedrine. With its added methyl group molecule, Pervitin races across the blood-brain barrier a bit faster than Benzedrine. Otherwise, the two drugs have virtually the same impact. Hitler again ordered more supplies for the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. During the airborne invasion of Crete, German paratroops and mountain troops carried Pervitin in their kits. In fact, its consumption actually increased when Hitler doubled the availability during Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which was launched on June 22, 1941. The world was shocked at the speed of the German attack and the amount of terrain taken, but that steamroller ground to a halt by December 1941. But this was back when the side effects and risks of addiction were really being seen. Soldiers were dying because of heart failure or committing suicide due to the psychosis influence, which prompted taking it off the civilian open market. Due to the very long summer days in North Africa, Luftwaffe, Italian, British, and Commonwealth pilots were given their respective drugs in 1941 through 1942. The new 8th Army commander, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, took the recommendation of Dr. Q.B. Wallace and issued Benzedrine to his soldiers. For example, soldiers from the British 24th Armored Tank Brigade were prescribed 20 milligrams of Benzedrine per day. That was twice the amount recommended to RAF pilots just prior to the Second Battle of El Alamein in Egypt. Following the British victory in El Alamein, American soldiers entered the ground combat in North Africa in November 1942, with Operation Torch, the Allied landings in Algeria and Morocco, being successful. American soldiers were issued amphetamines in the form of Benzedrine when General Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered an initial 500,000 doses in order to battle combat fatigue following the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Allied commanders believed Benzedrine, an amphetamine similar to Pervitin, was the answer, hoping the amphetamine would defeat not just the need for sleep, but anxiety and fear among troops and overcome shell shock, or what we today call post-traumatic stress disorder. For Allied soldiers, caffeine or Coca-Cola coffee were always their primary stimulants of choice, but now they had Benzedrine. The German Navy was also using Pervitin as it was issued to U-boat crews, but was not mandatory to be taken, and the drug was re-engineered and then tested using varying amounts and combinations of cocaine and methamphetamines. The human guinea pigs used were prisoners of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp who were given the drugs and forced to carry heavy sacks of rocks and walk around a track. Benzedrine and Pervitin continued to be used and were quite popular after World War II. By the 1950s, amphetamines were marketed as a diet pill and mood enhancer, with celebrities like Marilyn Monroe and Jack Kerouac using the stimulants and promoting them. It has been debated as to the moral and ethical practice of giving soldiers drugs that sometimes had terrible side effects, some being fatal. Was using the drugs worth it in the long run? Another German veteran from the war, Otto Carius, one of the most successful tank and tank destroyer commanders, had a very interesting insight because after the war he became a chemist and pharmacist. Otto stated, "We had the pills, which I thought were a good idea, especially during the big fights in 1943 in the East. But after a while I could see that there was a very bad after effect and I stopped taking them to stay awake. I realized that having my tank shot at was enough to keep anyone awake. Later, as I learned pharmacology, I realized just how dangerous Pervitin was, and I would never recommend it for general use." Pervitin may have fueled the lightning speed of the Blitzkrieg, but it came at devastating cost. Soldiers who once felt invincible were left broken, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Addiction, psychosis, and death followed many who had marched for days without sleep, driven by a chemical promise of power. Even Hitler himself wasn't immune. As his empire crumbled, so did his body and mind, ravaged by years of drug dependency, paranoia, and delusion. The story of Nazi Germany's drug-fueled war machine forces us to confront an unsettling truth. When victory is the only goal, how far are we willing to go, and at what cost? So what do you think? Was the use of performance-enhancing drugs in World War II a necessary evil of warfare, or an unforgivable violation of human ethics? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like.
Direct reflection of your beliefs, thoughts, and emotions about money.
Childhood trauma can have a direct, lasting impact on physical health, mental health, and the ability to function in society. But we didn't have any idea how much impact it had until the late 1990s, when a curious doctor made a groundbreaking discovery. Dr. Felitti led an obesity clinic at Kaiser Permanente. In the late 1980s, he observed a strange phenomenon where many patients who successfully lost weight quickly regained it. Some even dropped out of the program even though they were successful. So he was curious about this pattern, so Dr. Felitti started interviewing patients to understand why they regained the weight. And during these interviews, he uncovered that a significant number of these patients had a history of childhood trauma and abuse. So he started to wonder if obesity might be a coping mechanism for dealing with the unresolved trauma. So Dr. Felitti collaborated with the CDC to ask over 17,000 adults about their exposure to various types of childhood trauma, and these are called Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs for short. The original ACEs study identified 10 categories of these experiences, which can be grouped into 3 broad categories: abuse, which includes physical and emotional and sexual abuse; neglect, which is physical and emotional neglect; and household dysfunction, which includes domestic violence, substance abuse, untreated mental illness, parental separation or divorce, or parental incarceration. Now, the original study didn't explore other forms of adversity like environmental violence, like war or gang violence or crime, or relocation, like moving, asylum seeking, or divorce, grief and loss, racism, prejudice, or poverty. But even just with their limited study, they had 2 findings that changed our understanding of childhood trauma forever. First, they found that a huge number of people have experienced at least one ACE, 64% of people. And then they found that 17% of children, so that's 1 in 6 children, experience at least 4 ACEs. Even more specifically, 28% of women and 16% of men reported being sexually abused during their childhoods. And this study was done with mostly middle-class white folk, but the rates are actually probably higher with other demographics. So that was the first finding, that childhood trauma is way too pervasive. And then the second big finding, Dr. Felitti found that this trauma is directly correlated with a wide range of negative health outcomes in adulthood, including chronic disease, mental health issues, substance abuse, and early death. Okay, so let's dive into this a little bit. Let's explore the impact of childhood trauma on physical health. So ACEs increase your chance of autoimmune conditions, heart disease, diabetes, or obesity. With 6 ACEs, you are twice as likely to have cancer and 15% more likely to have a chronic disease like heart, lung, or liver disease. ACEs fuel behavioral problems like substance abuse, smoking, risky sexual behavior, and criminal activity. With 4 or more ACEs, you're 17 times more likely to struggle in school and 7 times more likely to be an alcoholic. And then, of course, childhood trauma massively impacts mental health. People who didn't experience ACEs as a child have around a 12% chance of experiencing depression, compared to a 35% chance for men and a 66% chance for women who did experience ACEs in their childhood. With an ACE score of 6, there's a 5,000% increase in suicide attempts, in the likelihood of a suicide attempt. And adverse childhood experiences increase your chances of PTSD, anxiety, and most other mental health concerns. And ACEs are directly related to at least 1/3 of mental health conditions in adulthood. So by helping children grow up in safer homes, we could reduce the rate of depression by 44%. This is just so impactful. The ACEs study was one of the first to demonstrate how childhood trauma could have a lasting impact on physical and mental health. And childhood trauma can impact basically every aspect of your life. The ACEs study showed that it can impact our ability to form healthy relationships or perform at work. Now, I do think that almost everyone experiences something in their childhood that they could consider traumatic, and the study found that 2/3 of people experienced at least one of these events on the ACEs list. But when we have supportive adults in our lives, most of us have the capacity to process through a traumatic experience. Sadly, though, at least 1/3 of the kids with an ACE had at least 4 ACEs, which means that they were living with recurring trauma that permeated multiple aspects of their life. And this trauma was often coming from the people who were supposed to be supporting them. The ACEs study found that the more ACEs a person experiences, the higher risk for these negative impacts in their adult years. So in addition to the individual suffering caused by childhood trauma, it's also really expensive for our society. The Journal of American Medical Association recently published a new study that found that ACEs cost our nation a staggering $14 trillion annually because of the related health conditions, but also the cost of law enforcement and substance abuse treatments and incarceration, all the lost productivity that people have due to disabilities from depression and other mental health concerns. Now, childhood trauma is having a massive impact on our society and on our individual and personal health. But this isn't all bad news. Understanding ACEs has led to the development of trauma-informed care. So this helps teachers and doctors and therapists recognize and respond to the effects of trauma in both children and adults. So that's one of the good things that came from this study. So let's just explore for a second why trauma can be so harmful to physical health, and then we'll explore what we can do about it. So, how does trauma increase the risk of disease? Chronic exposure to stress during childhood can lead to long-lasting changes in how the body and the brain react to stress, which can contribute to various health problems later in life. The body's stress response system, also known as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, is responsible for managing how the body reacts to stress. When faced with a stressful situation, the HPA axis triggers the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These hormones prepare the body for a fight or flight response, which increases your heart rate, your blood pressure, your blood sugar levels, and a bunch of other physiological changes. Now, adversity isn't inherently bad. When a child faces adversity and has caring adults to support them and access to resources to recover and restore their sense of safety, they can develop a healthy response to stress, where their parasympathetic response, the calming response in the nervous system, kicks on. And adversity with support can make them more resilient, confident, and capable. But when a child is isolated or threatened by their own caregivers or exposed to repeated stressors, they never get a chance to restore that sense of safety. So this creates chronic stress, which can interfere with the body's natural ability to regulate. The HPA axis can become dysregulated and can get stuck in one of two states: hyperarousal, which is where the stress response becomes overactive, which leads to consistently high levels of cortisol and other stress hormones. And this chronic stress response can damage body systems over time, including cardiovascular, immune, and digestive systems. And then the second way the nervous system can respond is sometimes it gets stuck in hypoarousal. So the HPA axis becomes underactive, leading to an insufficient release of cortisol. This is essentially getting stuck in the freeze state or the shutdown state, and this can make it difficult for the body to respond appropriately to stress. So this might leave an individual feeling overwhelmed or unable to cope with challenges. It looks like depression. Now, ACEs can also cause structural and functional changes in key brain areas involving stress regulation. So this includes the amygdala, which plays a crucial role in processing fear and emotional responses. It looks like depression. Now, ACEs can also cause structural and functional changes in key brain areas involving stress regulation. So this includes the amygdala, which plays a crucial role in processing fear and emotional responses. It can become hyperactive due to ACEs, and this makes people more sensitive to perceived threats, and it leads to these heightened anxiety and fear responses. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive functions like decision-making and impulse control, and this can become less effective in regulating emotional responses after trauma. So people who've experienced trauma have a harder time making rational decisions and managing stress and dealing with the pressures of life. Changes to the hippocampus can impair memory and cognitive function, and they can also reduce our ability to properly assess and respond to stressful situations. Okay, so long story short, childhood trauma is really harmful to our mental health, our physical health, our brain, and our stress response in our nervous system. But can it be treated afterwards? Yes. As we learn how trauma impacts mental and physical health, better treatments for trauma have been developed. So schools, workplaces, and doctors are implementing trauma-informed care, and individuals can get support through various types of therapy, education, and experiences. I have a whole playlist on these treatments, so you could check that out. I'll link that in the description. But I really do believe that we humans have a massive potential for post-traumatic growth, and we have the ability to heal and to learn to regulate our nervous systems and to improve our brain and body's ability to regulate stress. It's just that most people have never been taught how to do so. So if you want to learn more, there's a ton of resources out there. I'm making a document to put as many of the good ones as I can find in one place. And of course, you can take my free grounding skills course to learn the basics of how to regulate your nervous system. And again, I'll make sure and link those down below. Now, another interesting thing is if you're interested in whether adverse childhood experiences might be affecting you now, you can take an ACEs quiz over at NPR. and I'll link that in the description as well. Okay, so yes, trauma can be treated, but even more importantly, can it be prevented? And I would say yes, absolutely. We don't just want to have an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff picking up the kids who fell off the cliff. We want to build a fence at the top of the cliff, preventing children from getting hurt in the first place. I really do believe that we can prevent ACEs, and a large study by the CDC has explored how. And I'm going to share some lists, but what it really comes down to is building up community support for families, strengthening marriages, and supporting parents. It involves helping people learn the skills to function better at work and school and build financial security. And this can be as simple as helping families connect to free parenting resources, or volunteering in your local school and you're reading to kids, or being a big brother, big sister. It makes a difference if you connect with your neighbors, or you support community programs, or even just working on your own healing process can help break the chain of generational trauma. When children have a handful of supportive people in their lives, that can make all of the difference. And adversity can become a resilience factor instead of leading to PTSD. Now, I am feeling really fired up about this right now. I seriously believe that you people watching my videos can take active steps to stop passing down generational trauma, whether that's just by taking small steps to improve your own mental health, or strengthening your family, or reaching out and supporting your community. So comment below, what is the one small step you're going to take this week to help prevent childhood trauma? Thank you for watching, and take care.
Today we're going to be diving into what I believe are some of the most dangerous prescribed drugs out there. Unfortunately, many people taking these medications are never told about the rare but devastating side effects they can cause. And what's more, I've curated this list to focus on common drugs, so it's very likely that you or someone that you care about might be taking one of these right now. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Joseph Witt-Doerring. I'm a doctor and I used to work at the FDA and in the pharmaceutical industry as a drug safety expert. So let's get into it. The first drugs that we're going to talk about are the antidepressants. So these are drugs like the SSRIs, things like Lexapro and Prozac, and they're used for treating depression, bipolar, and anxiety. Now, while these medications are often experienced as being calming and therapeutic by many, some people will have paradoxical reactions, meaning that they become more anxious or agitated, or in the worst cases, sometimes even suicidal, homicidal, or even psychotic. Now, the internet is full of stories about these drugs being involved in things like suicides and school shootings, and often the most well-known cases involve a drug called Paxil, which is an SSRI. And two notable cases really come to mind for me. One is the case of David Carmichael, who killed his 11-year-old son accidentally during a Paxil-induced psychotic episode. Later on, this case would go on to be dismissed by the Supreme Court of Ontario due to clear evidence that this was drug-related. And the other case comes from close to me. I'm in Utah, but over in Wyoming, one state over, Donald Schell accidentally killed his wife, daughter, and his granddaughter, and then himself when he had a psychotic reaction to Paxil as well. Donald Schell's son-in-law, who lost his wife, actually went on to successfully sue SmithKline for failure to warn about these types of side effects with their drug Paxil. Now, over the last couple decades, there have been thousands of cases just like Donald's and David's, and these ultimately resulted in the boxed warning that goes on all antidepressants, which warn about the risk of suicidal behavior and behavioral changes on these drugs. So moving on from some of these serious behavioral problems these drugs can cause, the other thing that I want to mention about antidepressants is that they can also cause something called PSSD, or post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. Now, over the last several decades, thousands of people have been coming forward and sharing that the sexual problems that they developed on these drugs have not fully resolved now that they've come off of them. And some people are even reporting serious cognitive damage from these medications. This has prompted regulators in Europe, Australia, Canada, and Hong Kong to update the labeling on all of these drugs to warn about these persistent sexual problems that are not going away when people come off these drugs. Although this was under-recognized for a long time, finally it's getting some of the attention it deserves, and it has been covered in news outlets like the New York Times. The next drugs that we're going to talk about are the ADHD medications. These are drugs like Adderall, Ritalin, or Strattera, and they're used to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in children and adolescents. And honestly, from my perspective, it should not be surprising to people that ADHD medications can cause some severe behavioral problems. They are, after all, mechanistically similar to stimulant drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine. These are drugs that are acting on our dopamine system. However, many people assume that they're not going to have problems with these drugs when they're used at these normal therapeutic doses. But that's not the case. In fact, some people who are just very sensitive to these medications can have side effects, just like the case of Natalie, an Australian woman who spiraled into a drug-induced mania on Ritalin. And when she eventually came off the drug, she looked back and saw what had happened. She had lost her job, she'd lost her partner, she'd lost custody of her 2 children, and she had burned through $120,000. Now, there have been thousands of cases just like Natalie, and the risk of these behavioral problems are now at least widely recognized by regulators, and they are present in the drug labels. And that's what we can see in labels like Adderall's label, where it talks about the risk of psychiatric adverse reactions, including the risk of inducing new psychotic or manic symptoms in some people. The next drug on the list is aripiprazole, also known as Abilify. Now, this is an antipsychotic medication, but it's also very commonly used as an antidepressant. For many people, this is a popular antipsychotic to take because it's associated with less weight gain and less sedation compared to some of the other drugs. And that's because it's a partial dopamine agonist. And I want you to remember that because most antipsychotics block dopamine. And when something is a partial dopamine agonist, that means it can actually stimulate that receptor sometime. And what do we know about stimulating dopamine receptors? Well, it's associated with things like compulsive behavior, addictive behavior, and sometimes things like disinhibition. I mean, those dopamine receptors is where drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine really act on. And that point is going to be important for this. So since Abilify has been on the market, hundreds of people have actually come forward and blamed Abilify for causing all types of compulsive or disinhibited behavior, things like gambling or sex addiction. For instance, one of the people who complained about this was Abby Hawksley, who went on a $10,000 shopping spree shortly after starting this drug. And then there was another instance of a Las Vegas woman who had lived there for decades and had no history of gambling, but developed a gambling addiction shortly after taking it. And this got so bad that she actually ended up engaging in prostitution to make money. Now, I know what you're thinking when you hear these stories. Could this just be people blaming poor life decisions on a drug? And now, while initially a lot of people thought this was the case, but there were so many reports that the FDA decided to look into this. And after their independent investigation in 2016, they determined that this was in fact a real side effect, that this drug was causing a lot of disinhibition and compulsive behavior. And they went on to update their labels for Abilify. On top of that, the victims of this side effect ended up teaming up for a class action lawsuit against the manufacturer of Abilify, Otsuka and BMS, for failure to warn. These lawsuits were eventually settled for an unknown amount. Now, the next drug we're going to talk about is the smoking cessation drug, varenicline or Chantix. Now, this is a drug used to help people stop smoking by binding to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in the brain, which is potentially a great thing because so many people die from smoking each year. However, after this drug came onto the market, a lot of people started reporting that it was causing a whole range of strange behaviors. And one of the most well-known cases of this is what happened to the famous Texas musician Carter Albright, who went out, had a couple drinks, and took his dose of Chantix. Apparently, after he took his dose of this medication, he entered some kind of bizarre, aggressive delirium, which according to his friends and girlfriend was completely uncommon for him, even if he had been drinking a lot. While he was in this state, he actually attacked his girlfriend and then tried to break into his neighbor's house. While he was pounding on the door of his neighbor's homes and terrifying the neighbor, a warning shot was fired through the door and it accidentally struck Carter in the head and killed him. Now, this was absolutely devastating to his girlfriend, and she believed strongly that it was the Chantix that put him in this psychotic delusional state that resulted in his death. Now, for a long time, the manufacturers of Chantix tried to deny it, and they actually tried to say that these symptoms were being caused by nicotine withdrawal. But eventually, because hundreds of people came forward reporting similar things, the FDA looked into this, and they ended up going on to update the label of this drug with a boxed warning, which is the strongest warning to warn about all of the neuropsychiatric side effects that could happen, things like depression and suicide and aggressive behavior. The next drug we're going to talk about are the Z drugs. Now, these are a type of sleeping medications, and you may have heard of them. This is things like Ambien, Sonata, and Lunesta. Now, there have been reports of people doing all sorts of things that they could never remember while they were asleep on this drug, like making food, driving their vehicles, making phone calls, and even things like having sex. Probably the one that a lot of people remember recently was Roseanne Barr, who was tweeting and she said some racist things, and she said it was because she was high on Ambien, and that was her defense. So putting that aside, because I don't really know what happened in that situation, I want to focus on the risk, and the risk is real because when the FDA eventually looked into their drug database, they found 66 incidents of these crazy behaviors happening on the drugs. And unfortunately, 20 people had accidentally died because of the things that they had done while they were on the drug. Now, probably one of the most widely known cases involving this was the case of Kerry Kennedy. This is RFK Jr.'s sister. And a couple of years ago, she mistakenly took Ambien instead of her thyroid medicine, and unbeknownst to her, got into her car and started erratically driving down the freeway. And she accidentally sideswiped a truck. And she had no recollection of the incident because she was such a widely known figure. This ended up going to court and there was a jury. And after the jury had heard the evidence, they ended up acquitting her of charges. Now, the next drug we're going to be talking about is mefloquine or Lariam. This is a drug used to treat or prevent malaria, and it's been used since the 1970s. It's a kind of drug that's used these days when there's a college kid going abroad for travel, or here in Utah, we've got like a lot of missionaries and they go overseas for their mission. And the frightening thing about Lariam is it can actually cause really severe neuropsychiatric side effects. And one of these cases actually occurred in 2019, and it involved a young lady, Alana Cutland, who was 19. She was a biology student who traveled to Madagascar to study crabs for an internship. And she had been taking this drug in preparation for the trip. And a few days after arriving, her behavior began to change. And her mother noticed that when she talked to her on the phone, she just wasn't sounding like herself, and she was kind of incoherent at times. And it was later reported by people who saw her there that she started to have all of these panic attacks which would come out of the blue. And so eventually, when she wasn't feeling well, she decided to cut her 6-week trip short and return home early. And so she jumped in a Cessna plane to leave the island, and they took off. However, shortly after taking off, unexpectedly to everyone on the plane, she opened the door and tried to jump out. This happened to the horror of her friend who was with her in the plane at the time, who reportedly had to lean out and grab her leg to try and keep her from falling out of this plane. Horrifically, as this is described in the articles that have covered this story, this happened for 5 minutes before ultimately her friend was not able to save her, and she fell 3,600 feet into a remote jungle where unfortunately she died. Now, her parents maintain that she had everything to live for, and this was completely unusual, unexpected behavior, and they are convinced that she was actually having a psychotic reaction to the Lariam which she had been taking. Now, Alana's case does not stand alone. In fact, there have been hundreds of similar cases of this described in the news and also in the medical literature. And because of this, mefloquine now carries a boxed warning for severe neuropsychiatric side effects. Now, the next drug we're going to talk about is Montelukast or Singulair. Gosh, this is a really popular drug. It's used for asthma and allergies. It's been on the market for approximately 20 years. And for many people, it has become the go-to treatment for asthma, especially in kids, because they don't like using the inhalers, and this comes in just a tablet form. Unfortunately, what people have found is actually that this drug has some really serious side effects that these inhalers don't have. And these are severe psychiatric side effects like becoming suicidal or severely depressed. And one such tragic incident of this involved a young man, Nicholas England, who was 22 years old, who unexpectedly shot himself, and he died in 2017, 2 weeks after starting Singulair. This was completely unexpected to his parents, who said that he had no previous mental health issues before this happened. Now, there have been hundreds of cases just like Nicholas's that were reported to the FDA that eventually resulted in them doing a public advisory meeting to hear from experts and from people who had suffered from this died in 2017, 2 weeks after starting Singulair. This was completely unexpected to his parents, who said that he had no previous mental health issues before this happened. Now, there have been hundreds of cases just like Nicholas's that were reported to the FDA that eventually resulted in them doing a public advisory meeting to hear from experts and from people who had suffered from this side effect to learn more. And when the FDA looked into this in 2019, they found 82 documented suicide attempts where doctors thought Singular had been the causative agent, along with 500 suicide attempts that people had thought had been induced by the drug. Now, one of the interesting things about an FDA advisory committee is that you get to hear reports from the patients live. Now, I want to show you some of these things that these people said they experienced while being on Singular. So check this out. So one person read, "In April, the voices started. I thought I was going insane. I would look around the room knowing I heard a voice even when no one was there. It began to tell me to close the windows or just single words calling me names like bitch, asshole, and loser. At that point, I became even more withdrawn, not knowing what to do, and I would sleep for days at a time just to avoid the voice. The day it told me to hurt myself with a knife, I went off the Singular. Within a week, I noticed the voice was gone." Or this mother who described what happened to her 7-year-old child. "And then came the words. He would say, 'I'm not worth anything. I'm so stupid. Everything would be better if I'm not here.' He was consumed with death, always asking me about dying, telling me he didn't think he should be alive. At age 7, he actually attempted to take his life. I had to tackle my 7-year-old child as we fought over the knife he grabbed in the kitchen. I had to hold him while he screamed uncontrollably that he didn't want to be alive anymore." Now, ultimately, the research the FDA looked into led to them determining that, yes, in fact, these side effects were totally real and Singular was causing all of these things. And so they put a boxed warning on the drug. This is the strongest warning you can have, which described these side effects in detail. Now, interestingly, many people thought that this recognition that this drug could cause such horrific side effects would absolutely tank the use of this drug. That has not happened at all. In fact, many people still do not know that Singular can cause these things, and Singular is still being prescribed at very high levels in the US. Okay, moving on. So the next drug we want to talk about is isotretinoin, otherwise known as Accutane. Now, this is a drug that is used for treating severe acne, and it's been on the market since 1982, and it's actually one of the most effective treatments for that. However, the problem is, in rare instances, it can cause severe psychiatric side effects that can be catastrophic and sometimes long-lasting, lasting even after the people come off the drugs. Now, probably the most widely publicized case of this happening to someone would be that of Bart Stupak's son, Bart Jr., or BJ. Now, back in 2000, BJ shot himself in the head for seemingly no reason 6 months after starting Accutane. According to his parents, he had had no mental health problems and absolutely everything to live for. Now, initially back then, the drug companies and many dermatologists denied that isotretinoin could even cause such a thing. They would say things like, it's the acne that's causing it. These kids, they have depression associated with the acne. And for a long time, that's what people believed. However, hundreds of these cases kept on coming forward from bereaved parents who didn't understand why their children were becoming unexpectedly suicidal or depressed, even when you would take into account that they had acne and they might be upset about that. Ultimately, the FDA would receive enough of these reports that they would look into it, and they would put a warning on the drug telling doctors that mood disturbances, depression, suicidal thoughts, psychosis, and aggression could all happen with this drug. Personally, I'm very upset about this warning. I actually think it is very weak because it doesn't talk about the long-term cognitive damage that I've seen in some Accutane patients. Now, on this channel, I interview people who have had drug injuries, and one comes to mind, and that was the story of Robert when he was talking about his son Luke, who was severely damaged by isotretinoin. It actually caused long-lasting brain damage that led to Luke eventually deciding to take his life. If you want to hear from Robert about this tragic story, you can check out the video right here. It is one of the most toxic and dangerous side effects that I have ever seen. And I actually believe the FDA should have gone a step further than just putting this in the label. They should have sent a Dear Doctor letter out to every family medicine doctor and dermatologist warning about the potential for long-term cognitive damage on this drug. This is so important in my opinion because honestly, this is a lifestyle drug. I mean, this is not saving someone's life. It's helping them with acne. And I think most people, if they knew that this drug could cause such long-lasting cognitive problems and things like depression and suicide, that might factor into their decision to take this drug. So I really think the FDA should have gone a step further. So the next drug is finasteride, also known as Propecia. Now, this drug was originally developed to treat enlarged prostates, but now it is widely sold through online pill mill companies like Hims, where they market it for male pattern baldness. And it does work for that. Now, unfortunately, a small proportion of patients who take this drug develop a condition called post-finasteride syndrome, which is characterized by severe depression, cognitive problems, and also sexual dysfunction, sometimes catastrophic sexual dysfunction. And over the last couple decades, thousands of these cases have been widely discussed online and in the medical literature. And this ultimately led to an update in the drug labeling in 2022 to disclose the risk of these psychiatric problems and this persistent sexual dysfunction that happened even after they stopped the drug. Now, in my perspective, this is one of the worst warnings the FDA has ever put out because they've hidden it in the post-marketing experiences section of the label, which a lot of doctors don't read. Now, typically, when you have a serious side effect, something like persistent sexual dysfunction or new onset depression, you want to put that in a more prominent section of the labeling. They haven't done that here. Now, again, why is this so serious? Well, this drug is a lifestyle drug. This is not used to treat life-threatening conditions. This is used to treat people who are balding. Now, wouldn't you want to know if you were going to take this drug, whether it could cause persistent sexual dysfunction or make you depressed? A lot of people my age, young men in their 30s, are balding right now and they are taking this. And this would weigh heavily on their decision, no matter how rare this is. Even if it was super rare, you would want to know it because this is not a life-threatening condition. I think the FDA has totally flubbed on this. I think it should be in a much more prominent place in the label, and it should have gone out with a Dear Doctor letter, again, to all family medicine doctors who prescribe this for male pattern hair loss. Now, if you want to learn more about this, again, we also cover people's stories with PFS on this channel, and you can check out Sumer's story here, who was a young college student whose life was derailed when he ultimately went on to develop PFS. Now, the last drugs on this top 10 list are the fluoroquinolone antibiotics. These are drugs like levofloxacin or Levaquin or ciprofloxacin. These are antibiotics that are used to treat quite common bacterial infections, things like UTIs or sinus infections. And in rare instances, these drugs can cause some of the most horrific side effects I've ever seen. We're talking about severe psychiatric and neurological problems, cognitive damage, and this can leave people with damage for years that can sometimes be permanent. Personally, having researched this and also talked to a lot of people who have had this happen to them, I would never allow anyone in my family to take these antibiotics if there were any other options. Now, the colloquial term for what happens on these medications is called being floxed. And this has happened to thousands of people. But perhaps the most well-known case was the case of what happened to Bobby Caldwell, who was a famous singer who you may remember from this song. Now, Bobby Caldwell took one of these fluoroquinolone antibiotics after he had developed a cold and went to an urgent care in preparation for a tour he was doing in Japan. Shortly after taking this drug, he was floxed, and it actually left him in a wheelchair, being unable to play his guitar, with a whole range of devastating side effects. Now, the articles that I've read about Bobby Caldwell show that he was severely disabled from this for the rest of his life and actually died with a lot of these side effects. An absolutely devastating outcome. Now, because these side effects are so horrific and there have been so many of them, the FDA has picked up on this and they've updated their labels to warn about this deadly side effect. So there you have it. Those are the top 10 commonly prescribed drugs that I believe could completely ruin someone's life. All of these risks are described in the drug labels, but from my perspective, doctors rarely warn people about them. And honestly, the FDA isn't really communicating them effectively to people either, because most people have never heard of them. And what I've seen is these things can happen to anyone. I mean, the children of famous politicians, famous musicians, and just thousands of everyday people out there. So if you or someone you love is taking these drugs or considering taking these drugs, please think about these side effects and watch closely for them. So if you like videos like this that go into the risks of psychiatric medications, you may be interested in checking out this playlist here where we cover the real life stories of people going through this very thing.
New Plump Ambition by L'Oréal Paris.
Have you ever wondered about the difference between amphetamine and methamphetamine and their distinct impacts on the body? Well, if you have, hold on tight because we're about to deep dive into the specifics that make these two substances different and complex. So let me take you into the world of amphetamine and methamphetamine. Hi everyone, welcome to Psychiatry Simplified. I'm Sunil Regge, consultant psychiatrist. This is the channel where we break down complex topics in psychiatry into easy to understand concepts. If that's your thing, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notifications bell to stay in touch with all the latest releases.
So let's get started.
Now, oral methamphetamine, also known as Desoxyn, is available in the US for the treatment of ADHD in children above the age of 6. It's also available for the treatment of obesity. Amphetamines, on the other hand, are both well-known and commonly utilized in the treatment of ADHD in children and adolescents and adults. They come in various forms, as we know. You might have heard of Adderall, Dexedrine, which is dexamphetamine, and longer-acting versions. So in today's video, we'll be discussing the 5 most important differences between amphetamine and methamphetamine. So let's dive straight in. All right, before we begin, here's a mind-blowing fact. If you're in your 40s, you've likely used methamphetamine without even realizing it. That's right. Prior to 1994, Vicks vapor inhalers contained a form of methamphetamine which was lev-methamphetamine. Imagine that. So, the first difference, the structure. Methamphetamine has 2 stereoisomers. These are sort of mirror images. Methamphetamine comes in 2 forms, which is the S-methamphetamine and R-methamphetamine. The S isomer packs a more potent punch than its counterpart, the R isomer. So the R stereoisomer is the same as lev-methamphetamine, which was there prior to 1994 in the Vicks vapor inhalers. Amphetamine, on the other hand, consists of 2 enantiomers, D-amphetamine and L-amphetamine. So we know dexamphetamine or Dexedrine is available for treatment. Structurally, the main thing that makes methamphetamine different from amphetamine is that the S-amphetamine carries a methyl substituent, and this changes the entire pharmacology of methamphetamine. The second difference is the effect on the dopamine transporters. You see, methamphetamine takes the crown when it comes to the effect on dopamine levels. Studies show that it can boost dopamine levels by an astounding 2,600%, and it does this by stimulating the release of dopamine rather than simply blocking it. So you get a significant effect on dopamine release. Now, studies have shown that methamphetamine released 5 times more dopamine than amphetamine did at physiological membrane potentials. And this significant dopamine release contributes to the euphoric and addictive properties of methamphetamine compared to amphetamine. Too much dopamine can be harmful to the brain. The third difference is in route of administration. Methamphetamine can be ingested orally, snorted, injected, or even smoked, which often makes it a versatile and widely abused substance. Amphetamine, on the other hand, is taken orally or intranasally, and of course may be misused intravenously. However, unlike the hydrochloride salt of methamphetamine, amphetamine sulfate is insufficiently volatile to be smoked. And one of the reasons for the addictive potential of methamphetamine is this smokable form of methamphetamine that results in a very rapid and intense high. This does not happen with amphetamine, as amphetamine sulfate is insufficiently volatile to be smoked. The other aspect is that methamphetamine is highly lipophilic. We'll talk about that in just a bit when we come to the absorption. But because it's lipophilic, it passes through the blood-brain barrier very, very easily for its rapid effects. It's fascinating how just these subtle differences in the route of administration can make such a big difference to the ultimate impact on the brain. The fourth difference, the speed of action and bioavailability. Now, this speed of action and bioavailability is closely linked to the benefit and the risk balance, where amphetamine is a safer agent than methamphetamine. You see, methamphetamine's lipophilicity, which is the ability to dissolve in the fat and lipids, the adipose tissue of the body, gives it an advantage in terms of its bioavailability and speed of action. It allows methamphetamine to cross the blood-brain barrier much quicker than other stimulants, leading to a rapid and intense effect on the brain, which is linked to the euphoric property of methamphetamine. Now, when it comes to the onset and peak action, here's where the two substances differ. Methamphetamine typically kicks in about 5 to 30 minutes after ingestion, with its peak effects occurring about 2 to 4 hours later. Fascinatingly, a 30 milligram dose of methamphetamine may last up to 8 hours, making it a potent and long-lasting stimulant. On the other hand, when it comes to amphetamine, amphetamine takes slightly longer to kick in, onset ranging from approximately 30 to 60 minutes after consumption. And while it may not act as quickly as some of the other stimulants, it's important to remember that amphetamine-like substances all have significant effects on the brain. And this rapid action is something that we don't necessarily want. So to give you a further example of the difference, take Adderall XR. The dose of Adderall XR, which is mixed amphetamine salts used in the treatment of ADHD. Now, the common doses range from 5 milligrams to 30 milligrams. Now, higher doses are mentioned in literature, but this is sort of the general doses. Now, this can result in a peak plasma dexamphetamine or D-amphetamine level of approximately 10 to 110 nanograms per milliliter. In comparison, a single dose of crystal meth, which is sufficient to cause a significant rush, has been reported to be about 40 to 60 milligrams. But here's the issue. Real-life study of unsupervised recreational methamphetamine users as part of a police investigation showed that blood levels range from 50 nanograms to 1,600 nanograms per milliliter, with a median of 190 nanograms per milliliter. That is a significant level. And evidence also shows that the doses used by methamphetamine users over time tend to increase, and they may be binging type use that results in much higher levels of methamphetamine in the blood. Interestingly, the speed of onset can vary depending on the form in which these substances are used. For example, medically screened patients might experience a slower onset with oral forms of amphetamines, particularly those with cardiac abnormalities. On the other hand, unsupervised crystal meth users may opt for the smokable form of methamphetamine, which can provide a very rapid, fast onset within seconds to minutes. The differences in speed of action and bioavailability between methamphetamine and amphetamine has important consequences on the harm aspect related to the brain and the rest of the body as well. So that takes us to the fifth point, which is the pharmacological impact of methamphetamine and amphetamine on the brain. Now, both amphetamine and methamphetamine affect the metabolism of dopamine, noradrenaline, serotonin, and they increase the levels of all three neurotransmitters. However, one key difference lies in how methamphetamine generates way more dopamine efflux, the release, and higher calcium release compared to amphetamine. The difference could explain why methamphetamine firstly is more euphoric and addictive because of the dopamine efflux, but the ability of methamphetamine to release dopamine, serotonin, and inhibit MAO-A oxidase activity leads to what we call oxidation of dopamine and serotonin. Now, methamphetamine-induced neural damage is mediated by the production of free radicals that occur after there is significant calcium efflux, dopamine efflux, serotonin efflux. The point is that too much of these neurotransmitters can result in a significant oxidative stress, the release of free radicals, which are neurotoxic. Furthermore, what happens is when there is excess release of these neurotransmitters, essentially these neurotransmitters are depleted. So longer term use or severe use of this substance, methamphetamine, results in longer term dopamine and serotonin depletion in the striatum, which is the movement area of the brain. And sometimes we see this in clinical practice where they may be tremors, for example, or cogwheel rigidity, Parkinsonian type side effects because of methamphetamine use, and may also affect cognitive function. And of course, we know psychosis due to the dopamine hypothesis of psychosis can be significantly triggered off as well. Now, we do know that because of the significant dopaminergic, serotonergic, noradrenergic release, there are peripheral effects on the beta receptors and the alpha receptors that can result in cardiac effects, can result in vasoconstriction of the vessels, both peripherally and also cerebrally. And this results in, of course, significant impact on oral health, skin health, cardiovascular health, etc. Now, amphetamine compared to methamphetamine is, of course, safer because it does not have that significant amount of release of these neurotransmitters. However, misuse of amphetamine can result in a very similar picture. So evidence does show that amphetamine use can result in the depletion of dopamine, particularly what we call striatal dopamine transporters, over the long term. Now, this can be exacerbated in individuals who misuse it, but also one of the things that's relevant to psychiatric practice is that we prefer to prescribe the longer acting version so that we do not have these peaks and troughs, the pulsatile release of dopamine that is more linked to the euphoric, the addiction aspects. We prefer the tonic dopamine release, which is essential for reward learning, concentration, and movement. So to recap, we can see that amphetamine and methamphetamine are far from being just simple substances. They have significant effects on the brain, the specific neurotransmitters, the transporter parts of the brain, and this can have a significant impact overall on brain function. Understanding these nuances is crucial for clinical professionals, but also for individuals that are using these substances. If you found this video useful, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more simplified psychiatry content. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comment section. And of course, let us know what other videos you'd like. I look forward to seeing you in another video soon. Until then, stay fascinated. Bye-bye.
Before and after meth. Insane. Look at the damage caused in these pictures. And look at some of the hope, some of these end pictures. Wait for it. Let's get into it. K-Rugs, the Sober Dog, coming at you. Remember, Sober Dogs does not promote or condone any drug use. Please seek professional medical help if you have an addiction. This one is about before and after meth and the damage caused by meth. A lot of these were released by police departments and governments to help educate people on how quickly it can go insane. I mean, just looking at this one, you know, released from Faces of Meth by the police department when they were doing their campaign, just, you know, a year and a half into it, her face, all the wounds, all the scars, you know, insane. Those scars a lot of times are from a couple of different things I'll get into in a minute. This one, same thing. Look at the progression. Start 6 months, 4 years. Not that long of a timeline, and you could see how bad it's getting. Once again, a common theme, the scars and open wounds all over the face. This is a wild one. The reason I think this one is so important, this lady looks like she aged 25 years in that period of time. That is wild. She looks like she went from 35 to 55 overnight. This girl, same thing. You could see just from the start, like the innocence almost in her eyes. It's starting to get a little bit like, I know I'm struggling, but there's still a little bit of hope. There's still a little bit of life there. And then that second picture, the eyes tell it all. Just hopeless. And then those open wounds. So those open wounds, a lot of times, one, they're from picking. And if you want to see about coke bugs and meth mites, check out that video. I talk all about them. I was somebody who got this real bad. When I did coke, I would see bugs on me. I could hear them, I could feel them, and I would dig into my skin. Also, you get stuck when you do uppers. So imagine a normal day, you wake up, you go to the mirror, you're brushing your teeth, you see a pimple. Oops, maybe you pop it, maybe you wipe it off, you grab a little Kleenex, you wipe it off. Maybe you spend another 5 seconds, 10 messing with it. Now imagine that same process. You go in the mirror and you sit there for 6 hours popping every little imaginary, some real, pimple, blackhead on your face, a bunch that aren't real. And then after you pop it, you are so in the psychosis, insane state. You dig into it with a knife, your fingernails scratching it, scratching your whole face, popping stuff that's not there. I would literally have days where I went in front of the mirror to start messing with myself after I got high. Hours would go by. I have no idea how. I would look up. I did it again. Oh, that's the biggest tell. Scars all over my face, and everyone in my life would know that I either, was using again or whatever, because I had scars everywhere. It was like uncontrollable. I couldn't stop. This guy's got a real bad one. You could see, again, in that first photo, he's got he's struggling, but he's got a little bit of life to him, even with just the hair, so to speak, you could see. Then the second one, the burns and the scars. And the third one, that's all burns. I don't know exactly what it's from. I believe this story specifically, it's from shake and bake explosions, which are when people are making their own meth and it explodes because they don't know exactly what they're doing and all the chemicals react. That is all, the rest of his life, he's gonna have those marks and scars and probably need skin grafts and everything. And again, you could see in his eyes just the pain and the hopelessness. This one is meth mouth. All those chemicals in meth, things like battery acid and pseudoephedrine and different, things like that, lithium, destroy body tissue in the mouth and everything. Teeth fall out, tongues get different, discolored, mouth discolored, inside parts of the tongue can start getting scars and chunks taken out. It's bad. And this person, see what happens to their teeth, just like that. This is a bad one of meth mouth. And this one, you could tell too, what I assume also happened in this one, not only the chemicals, but you're so delusional and insane for days on end, you forget to just general mouth care. Something like brushing your teeth or drinking water, how important that is, dehydration to our mouth. The amount of work and money needed to repair that now is incredible. This one's crazy too. Look at the weight loss. That is nuts, the weight loss. I don't know how much weight this guy lost, but almost everyone, insane amounts of weight lost during meth addiction, because you just go hours and days without eating because you are so gone. The open wounds, the scars, the whole lifestyle around it brings those wounds and those scars. Here's another weight loss one. You could see how this just ruined her life. 7 years, and you could just see how much pain it caused. This is a bad one. The open wounds, again, the eyes and the facial expression, just the pain. Oh man, this one's really bad, and another example of when shake and bake goes wrong. She got burned. That's sad. That whole facial structure area. A lot of the scars and stuff can heal to an extent. The little ones when you're picking, but stuff like this, that's permanent. Skin grafts, it's insane. And then here's some happy ones to see the transition. Look at this. Holy crap. That is freaking wild. Just look at them. You could see this couple, wow. Wow, wow. You could see they look so much happier, so much more at peace. Awesome, congratulations for them. So cool. This girl, look at her. That's such an incredible transformation. So happy to see stuff like that. And you can just, again, look at the pain in reverse. This guy, the eyes say it all. First picture to second picture, recovery. Good for him, incredible. And the final one, this one is the most insane transformation to me. Wow, that is nuts. This picture went all over social media, and it's so cool to see. Look at that transformation. That is hope, and that is insane to
Free heroin supplied by the government. It's probably hard to wrap your head around that idea, but it's really happening.
It is something we're taking a look at in our special reports, The Heroin Fix. CBS 4 investigator Brian Moss here to explain this really radical idea, Brian.
It really is pretty wild. And the idea, first of all, is not on the table in Denver or in Colorado. However, doctors in Canada say it's producing meaningful results. Tonight, we take you inside North America's only clinic where the government is handing out the heroin. Taking hold in Vancouver, where heroin addiction is so bad and so many addicts are overdosing, the government pays for safe and sterile centers where addicts can bring their own heroin and shoot up.
You cannot change for anyone else, you need to change for yourself.
Denver is now considering a similar program of establishing safe sites for addicts to shoot up. The idea being overdose deaths can be prevented if addicts are supervised when injecting.
You don't have to overdose every time.
But Vancouver is taking things a step further, with the government also supplying some addicts with pharmaceutical heroin. That's right, government-supplied heroin for users like Lori Beer, who comes to this government office twice a day, every day of the year, to shoot up heroin, courtesy of the Canadian government.
If this place didn't exist, you'd still have your heroin problem. So what would you be doing? Where would you be at?
I'd be dead. I can honestly say that.
Dr. Scott McDonald supervises this clinic and says with heroin addiction viewed as a medical issue, not a criminal problem, this approach makes sense.
Heroin use, opioid addiction, is just a chronic disease, a long-term illness that's manageable with treatment.
McDonald says this approach also makes financial sense, reducing theft and incarceration costs. So every day of the year, 110 addicts line up for their government dose of heroin. The pharmaceutical heroin being consumed in Vancouver is actually manufactured here in Switzerland.
It's paid for by the government.
What do you think about that? Does that seem at all odd to you that the government is supplying your heroin?
Yeah, a little bit, but it's working, right? And it's saving lives.
Les Kazorski has been addicted to heroin for 30 years, but is now getting his heroin fix 3 times a day from the government.
I get to go there and I don't have to worry about, I know
he's now working and doesn't have to commit crimes to support his habit. And with government heroin, he knows the product is pure. So Les, what's the ultimate goal for you? I mean, what's...
Well, abstinence.
With a growing opioid and overdose problem in Denver, leaders here are stopping short of considering giving away heroin, but are seriously considering safe injection sites. We'll continue tracking the safe injection site debate here in Colorado. City officials from Denver plan to visit Vancouver in November, and you can view all of our stories on the Heroin Fix on CBSDenver.com.
Opioid epidemic, everyone's talking about it.
Everybody is talking about it. There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, thank you, Brian.
So it was both like methamphetamine and cocaine. And now you were admitted relatively recently for bacterial endocarditis.
This film shows stage by stage the optimal preparation and injection of street heroin. It doesn't illustrate sterile situation, but what it does do is show the best practice that could be adopted within a domestic setting. The film focuses on heroin, although many of the messages shown and the lessons learned apply directly across to the injection of other drugs. Improving adopting good practice is essential for ensuring the reduction of vein damage, soft tissue damage, a reduction in the transmission of bacterial and bloodborne virus infections. The washing of hands and the injecting site is an important part of the injecting process, and it's certainly worth encouraging users to adopt good hand washing techniques as well as improving hygiene. A number of studies have shown that hygiene is important in so much as it reduces contamination of injecting equipment and reduces the likelihood of bacterial infections. Any surfaces that are used for the preparation of drugs for injection should be clean and tidy. This will reduce the risk of contamination of any of the drug injecting equipment that's laid down and ready for use. Before preparing drugs for injection, all the necessary equipment should be to hand. Needles and syringes, cooker, sterile water, acidifier, filters, a heat source, the drug of course, and indeed any other equipment that might be needed. Remove the cooker from its sterile packaging. Place it on the surface. Add the heroin and add the water. Water for injection is ideal and is available from many areas. If not, water boiled in a kettle and allowed to cool is the next best alternative. Once the heroin and water have been added to the cooker, an acidifier is then added to help dissolve the heroin into solution. Heroin is an alkaline base and won't readily dissolve with water without the addition of an acid. However, it is really important to stress that only a small amount of the acid is used to help this process. Too much acid in the solution can cause significant irritation to the lining of the veins and exacerbate vein damage. The drug solution is gently heated. Applying heat accelerates the chemical reaction which helps the heroin dissolve. Stirring further helps this process. Any visible residue will almost certainly be in soluble products and not heroin. These will be filtered out in the next stage of the process. Before the drug solution is drawn up into the syringe, a filter is added, and these are readily available in commercially produced cookers. Alternatively, people may use cigarette filters, cotton wool or other bits of makeshift material to filter out the drug solution, although of course none of these will be sterile. Filtration of drug solution is necessary to remove any of the insoluble particles which, if injected, can block very fine capillaries and also block needles and syringes and prevent injection. Filters, like all injecting equipment, once used should be disposed of safely. Once the drug solution has been drawn up into the syringe, air bubbles may be present and it's common to evacuate these from the syringe. This is done by turning the syringe and needle upwards, pointing it upwards, tapping the side of the syringe and gently pressing the plunger to evacuate the air until a globule of drug solution is found on the tip of the needle. A range of techniques can be used to raise a vein and make injection both easier and safer. It's important for the body to be kept warm and well hydrated. Exercise, pumping of a fist, tapping the area to be injected, running the arm, for example, under warm water, all these things can help raise a vein and enable better and easier access. The correct use of tourniquets can actually make veins more prominent, easier to see and easier to inject into, and have the added advantage of stabilising wobbly veins and enhancing injecting technique and reducing the chance of injecting damage. Shoelaces, belts and rubber strips are typically used as tourniquets and used in such a way that they can be released prior to injection. Rubber strips have the added advantage of being able to be readily cleaned after use. Medical tourniquets are probably not that suitable for most people as they're designed to be used by one person on another and therefore not suitable for lone injection. Prior to injection, and unless the site has been previously cleaned, the site should now be cleaned with an alcohol swab, wiped in one direction, or indeed with soap and water. Place the needle with the eye of the needle facing upwards at point of injection and slowly but firmly insert through the tissue and into the vein. Before going ahead with the injection, the plunger is pulled back to check insertion. Blood drawn into the syringe indicates the needle is securely in the vein. If a tourniquet is being used, it is important to release it prior to injection, otherwise increased pressure in the vein can cause the vein to split, leading to a missed hit. The plunger is pressed steadily and the drug injected slowly so the drug solution can be carried away from the injection site. Once the drug solution has been injected, the needle and syringe should be withdrawn slowly, and a dry swab applied with pressure to reduce any bleeding and bruising of the injecting site. All injecting equipment should be disposed of safely. Knowledge of the injecting process, when adapted to meet individual needs and injecting circumstances and situation, can go an awful long way to ensure that people improve their practice, improve the safety of their injecting, reduce any injecting related harm and improve their health and well-being.